everyone, it's Hayes, and in today's video we're going to be discussing something kind of serious, and we're going to be talking about whether or not Adrien is being emotionally abused. I see this term be thrown around all the time where Adrien is concerned, so I thought it was best to make a video addressing whether or not he actually is being emotionally abused. However, emotional abuse is a very serious topic. This isn't going to be a super fun video. I'm not going to try to make light of emotional abuse or make jokes about it like I would usually do for another kind of topic we might talk about. This is a serious topic, so I'm going to be treating it seriously. So if you clicked on this video hoping, for a laugh, that's not what this video is going to be. It's a serious topic, so I'm going to treat it that way. So if you're not in the mood for something that's a bit more serious, worry not. I have plenty of other videos that you can go and watch that are going to be more funny than this one. However, if emotional abuse is something you have experienced and watching the introduction to this video is something that has already triggered you, I will leave below some resources you can check out to get some help. And if over the course of the video you realise that, hey, this might have been something I've gone through, then those resources are for you to check out as well. Emotional abuse, in comparison to things like physical abuse, isn't really talked about a lot. It's also called mental abuse as well, not just emotional abuse. It's not really talked about it a lot. We never learned about it in school. I didn't know it was a thing until I was 21, and I'm 25 now. I went 21 years without knowing it was a thing. A lot of people don't know a lot about it, and it is entirely possible, like with myself, that you didn't know it was happening to you until you found out what it was. So those resources will be down below for you as well. So like I briefly mentioned there, emotional abuse is something I have experienced. So whilst I'm not an expert on it, I do know a thing or two about it. And before anyone asks, yes, I'm okay, but no, I really don't want to talk about it, so please don't ask. Thank you. So whilst I'm not an expert, I do know a thing or two about it. However, this video is not meant to, represent all emotional abuse in general that is going on in the world. Part of my PhD is about bullying and suicide, things like that, and it's also about the cultural differences in different countries that may lead people to do things like that. So depending on what country you're from, these different signs, the different signs of emotional abuse may be culturally different to where you've come from, and therefore may be different to what you've experienced if this has happened to you. I am not trying to speak for all victims of emotional abuse in this video. While I am an expert on what happened to me, I am not an expert on what's happened to everyone in the whole world who has gone through this. Please do not take my word on this as the final word. If you don't know anything about emotional or mental abuse, this video might be a good introduction, since like I said, at least in the UK, no one really talks about this. Like in school we would talk about what to do if someone at home is hitting you or something like that, but we never covered this kind of abuse. So whilst this video could be used as a good introduction, I don't want you to go away from this video feeling like you know everything about emotional abuse. If it's something that interests you or you just want to know more about, I will leave some videos down below that go further into detail about some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video. And just one last thing I want to say, I definitely think it's possible that Thomas Astruc, when he was creating the character of Adrien and Gabriel, I think it's possible he didn't consciously make the conscious decision to have Gabriel be abusive to Adrien. It happens quite a lot actually, since emotional abuse isn't talked about. It's becoming more normal to talk about it, I guess, more common to talk about, should I say, possibly, where abuse is concerned in general, at least in the UK anyway. Obviously it'd be different depending where you're from. It's becoming slightly more normal here to talk about. However, a lot of people don't even know they are being emotionally abusive, and when it gets written about, it's obviously not something consciously that the author or the screenwriter or whoever does. It just kind of happens. And actually the most famous version of this happening is Cinderella. Of course there are different forms of abuse in the story of Cinderella, but at the heart of the story it is about a girl who's being emotionally abused by her stepfamily. And most people don't even realise what's going on. And speaking of Cinderella, I'll link down below one of my favourite films. It's free to watch on YouTube. The acting's not the best in it, but it's a modern retelling of Cinderella called Not Cinderella's Type, where it does a more in-depth look at emotional abuse as well as the help you can get for it, mainly in America. It's set in America, the film. so I will leave that link down below for you as well. So now we're just going to go down the list of all the signs of emotional abuse and see if that is what's happening between Adrien and Gabriel, with Adrien as the victim and Gabriel as the abuser, just so we can know definitively if this term is being used correctly for their relationship. So the first sign of emotional abuse is humiliation, negating and criticizing. So this can include things like name calling, as in like horrible name calling, character assassination, yelling, public embarrassment and insulting your appearance. And I would say, from my perspective of the show, Gabriel doesn't really do any of this. Arguably he doesn't even speak to Adrien enough to do any of this. But even when Adrien is in trouble, for example when he takes the grimoire in Volpina and we see the consequences of that in The Collector, Gabriel's pretty calm about it. He doesn't really yell. And I'm struggling to find in my memory an instance in the series where he's really shouted at Adrien. As Hawkmoth he may have shouted at a superhero, but we're not talking about other people's relationships, we're just talking about Adrien and Gabriel for the sake of this video. So he has definitely got angry in the show, and he has definitely been angry at Adrien, but I would argue that anger has been quite measured, you know? I don't particularly feel like the way Gabriel treats Adrien fits into this category of emotional abuse from my own experience. Gabriel has never called Adrien a name, and I know maybe as Hawkmoth he makes fun of him as Cat Noir. That's something completely different. He's not aware that's his son. Whilst it is a bit odd for him, a grown adult, to be treating a child like that, that's a different argument, but we're focusing on Adrien and Gabriel, not Cat Noir and Hawkmoth. I wouldn't say he assassinates his character, as in like tries to bring him down. He doesn't yell at him, he doesn't embarrass him in public because he never goes outside, and I've never heard about him insulting Adrien's appearance. In fact, he's quite happy with Adrien's appearance. He obviously is. Adrien is a model for his fashion brand, so to me, I don't particularly think Adrien is being emotionally abused in that way. The next category is control and shame, and I think Adrien and Gabriel's relationship, we can see some of this in this category. So this includes threats, location monitoring, direct orders and being unpredictable. So I definitely think it fits into this category, but not all the way, only to some extent. We definitely get the threats. So threats don't necessarily have to be about physical violence. It's not like do this thing or I will punch you. In the case of Miraculous, obviously in Adrien and Gabriel's relationship, these threats are, if you don't do this thing for me, this important thing, you don't get to go to school. As we saw in The Collector, the consequence of him taking the grimoire and losing it were, you're not going to school. And it's something Gabriel understands that means a lot to Adrien. And another part of this category they fit into is the location monitoring. For example, in Glaciator 2, we saw how like on it Gabriel was about Adrien, although I guess it was technically coming from a nice place. He was going to akumatize him, decided not to, and then asked the bodyguard to bring him home. However, we saw in Lies when Adrien and Kagami were still dating at the start of the episode, all the lengths Adrien was going to just so he could spend some time with Kagami, because he knows how strict his dad is and probably wouldn't let them see each other much unless it was like at something like fencing, for example. Now we could argue the location monitoring is just about how overprotective Gabriel is. Obviously Adrien has a bodyguard. We saw in episode 9 this season, as well as other episodes in the past, all the different security measures they have in place at the mansion. I would assume to protect all of them, not just Adrien. So he is obviously very protective of him, whether that's because he is a sentient monster, so Gabriel's like, we need to protect him even more so nothing happens to him, or purely because like Adrien is his child and he loves him and something bad's already happened to his wife. He doesn't want the same thing to happen to his son either. So I think we could maybe look at that from a couple of different angles. However, the threats part of this category, I feel Gabriel threatening all the time, like do this or I'll pull you out of school, is a bit unnecessary. He knows how much going to school and having friends means to Adrien, and as a result Adrien at this stage feels like he can do nothing wrong, because if he does something wrong, even if it's something tiny, like for example protesting in Megaleech, his dad's like, well, I'm going to pull you out of school, or there'll be some other kind of consequence, even when it's what normal children do. So I would say they definitely fall into that category of emotional abuse. The next category is accusing, blame and denial, and this is things like jealousy as well as gaslighting. So if you don't know what gaslighting is, first of all, the book and the film the girl on the train is a really good example of gaslighting, like to the absolute extreme. But it's when someone says to you, oh, I didn't hear you say that, or I didn't know you've done that, even though you saw them do it. Now, we've all probably done gaslighting unintentionally ourselves because we just forgot for some reason. So for example, my mum the other day was like, Hazel, why haven't you done this thing yet? I asked you this morning. And she may well have asked me this morning, but maybe she just thought she asked me this morning, because to my memory, I don't remember her asking me. So either she's wrong or I'm wrong, but we're both convinced that we're right. So that is an example of gaslighting. However, gaslighting in emotionally abusive relationship is often much more extreme than people genuinely forgetting whether or not someone has done something. They are intentionally saying, you have done this, you have not done this, with the goal to distress you emotionally about it, to make you paranoid, to make you feel guilty, so you apologise to the other person. Gabriel, I would say, does not do this to Adrien. Does he lie to Adrien? Yes, he does lie to Adrien about being Hawkmoth, but that's a completely different issue with just like trust in their relationship. But I would also argue Gabriel doesn't get jealous of Adrien in any way, so I don't believe they fall into that category of emotional abuse. The next category is codependency, which is about being codependent on another person. So this is things like neglecting your own needs in favour of theirs, you seek their approval, and you think you deserve being treated this way. So whilst Adrien definitely does seek Gabriel's approval, I don't believe it's in an abusive way. A lot of children want to have their parents' approval, especially for Adrien, who doesn't get to see his dad a lot, even though they live in the same house. He doesn't get to see his dad a lot and does want to seek his approval, but I don't believe Adrien is codependent on his dad. Does he love his dad? Yes, but that doesn't mean he's necessarily codependent on him. So I don't think they fit into this category either. And the final category, which I definitely do think Adrien and Gabriel fit into, is emotional neglect and isolation. So this involves things like demanding respect, shutting down communication, stopping you from going out, and withholding affection. Does that sound familiar where Gabriel and Adrien are concerned? Yes, it 100% does. So emotional neglect in this case between a parent and child is when the parent doesn't respond to a child's emotional needs. So for example, Adrien does want to speak to his father, he wants to spend time with his father, he wants to get to know his father better, as we found out in The Collector. The Collector's a really good example of their relationship. Adrien says, I guess I don't know much about you, because apparently the grimoire, obviously Gabriel is lying, but he says the grimoire is the source of inspiration for my fashion brand. And Adrien had no idea. Because of this disconnect between them, there is a lack of communication, and it's not Adrien's fault, it's Gabriel's fault. It's not like Adrien is ignoring his dad. His dad is essentially ignoring him, and he is closing off any emotional connection he has to Adrien. We saw in Glaciator 2 just how far apart the father and son had moved away from each other. Gabriel, for like the first time ever, was concerned about Adrien's emotional well-being. Previously he was only like bothered about his physical well-being. He kept her in the house for so long, presumably all of Adrien's life, until he left the house in Origins, which was when he was 13 years old. So I think we can assume for the most part from 0 to 13 Adrien has been at home, unless he was allowed out for whatever reason. I'm assuming for a fashion shoot they wouldn't have them all in the house. Or maybe they did, I don't know. But that scene in Glaciator 2 does seem like the first time Gabriel has been more attentive to Adrien's emotional needs, and by this point Adrien's just like, I don't care about what you have to say about this, because he doesn't think his father cares about him anymore, with the way Adrien is being ignored and neglected. So whilst I definitely think there are features of Adrien and Gabriel's relationship that fit into emotional abuse, I would argue there isn't enough for it to be emotional abuse. I would say Adrien is being emotionally neglected by Gabriel. Now, does this mean Gabriel doesn't love Adrien? Of course not. I definitely think Gabriel does love his son a great deal. Like, why would he go to all this extent to protect him if he didn't love him? Like, if he didn't love him, he'd be like, Adrien, go do what you want. I don't care. I will never talk to you again if that's what you want, if he didn't love him. I definitely do think Gabriel loves him. However, that doesn't mean it's okay to emotionally neglect someone. Now, in addition to this, I also think Adrien has something called a trauma bond. So a trauma bond is created, sorry I'm just reading off so I get it correct and I don't get it wrong and spread misinformation. That's the last thing I would want to happen. So a trauma bond is created from a hot and cold cycle of attention that's usually a back and forth between neglect and kindness. So it's it's essentially your brain getting confused from pumping out happiness hormones and stress hormones, and because it's often intense and happening a lot, your emotions get very confused. And even if you may not necessarily be trauma bonded, you probably have experienced this. So for example, you're at school one day, someone you think is your friend for whatever reason is treating you horribly that day. Now that may be because of something you have done, but it also may not be because of something you have done. They may have fallen out with someone else, they may have failed a test, they may have not got enough sleep, and as a result they're taking it out on you, and it makes you feel very confused, like why are they acting like this? But when they start being nice to you again, whether or not they've apologised for their behaviour, you're really happy to have them back. And something like that is probably like a one-off occurrence. It's probably not happening every single day. But if it is happening every single day, your brain gets more and more confused, and it's going to mess with your head, which is more crucial for Adrien since he's at home all the time prior to Origins, and unless he's at school or out being cat noir or doing modelling or something, he is also at home all the time. So this cycle between stress and happiness makes you kind of attached to the person who is causing this, because even if the times when his father won't speak to him are absolutely awful, the times when his father will spend time with Adrien are absolutely amazing. So for example, in Gorizilla, when they finally sit down and watch the film together, Adrien is absolutely delighted. He loves his father so much. He would do literally anything, as we found out, to please his dad. He wants to please his dad because of this bond they have, where any attention from his father, Adrien will essentially just latch onto it, no matter what kind of the attention is. Even if they just sit down to watch a film and don't speak during it, Adrien is just essentially desperate for any attention from his father. So let's just play devil's advocate for a minute here. It may not necessarily be a trauma bond in this case, it could just be Adrien is really happy to spend time with his dad. He understands his dad is busy with work and he's still mourning for his wife. I can understand that completely, but I think we definitely could argue there is a trauma bond going on. But even if there isn't a trauma bond going on, I think what Adrien is experiencing from his dad is emotional neglect rather than emotional abuse. I guess as someone who has been through emotional abuse, it was getting kind of annoying and almost hurtful, to be honest, to see other people throwing this term around without really knowing what it meant and if it actually did apply to Adrien and Gabriel. So I would say emotional neglect rather than emotional abuse. And whilst emotional neglect is part of emotional abuse, there needed to be more features of emotional abuse for it to be emotional abuse overall. However, that's not to say it can't maybe develop into that one day in the series. Right now where we are in season 4, it's just emotional neglect, but I think maybe depending what happens in the finale, because we all know Adrien is going to confront his dad, it maybe could escalate into something else. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much further they will go since this TV show is for children. If it was for teenagers or adults, I definitely think they would go a bit further, but since it is meant for 8 to 10-year-olds, despite the older audience watching it, they do still have to stick to the realms of what is okay for that target audience, although they do frequently not do that, so I'm not 100% sure. So I hope you enjoyed that deeper look at Adrien and Gabriel's relationship, although I think enjoy might be the wrong word to use. To me it is something interesting, even though it's something I've been through, but I hope I didn't upset anyone with anything I said in this video. If you think I said anything wrong and you do know more about emotional abuse than me, then please feel free to call me out in the comments and I will leave any corrections to this video in the pinned comment. I don't want to be spreading any misinformation. If I have said something incorrectly, I read pretty much all the comments. Call me out in the comments. If you don't feel brave enough to do it in the comments, you can email me, you can message me on Instagram, you can message me on Twitter, whichever works for you. If you don't want to do it in the comments, please tell me and I will leave any corrections to this video in a pinned comment. Obviously what I just went through was definitely a more superficial overview of emotional abuse. There is definitely a lot more to it, and anyone who has been emotionally abused, each person is more than likely going to have a very different experience depending on what their abuser was like and what country they were from, or the cultural difference as well. There's a lot to it. This was just a very superficial overview using what we have seen in the show so far, because to be honest, Adrien and Gabriel don't get to see each other that much. So I will leave all of those resources linked down below if you're feeling upset after this video. There are also links down below and resources for the suicide prevention hotlines in most countries, I'm pretty sure. Maybe I should check on them to check they're still up to date. It's been a while since I've checked them. So please check the links below if you feel you need any extra help. Please don't be afraid to ask for help if it's what you need. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you think about Adrien and Gabriel's relationship. Do you agree with me? Do you think it's emotional neglect, or do you still believe he is being emotionally abused? And I'll see you in the next one. Bye!